I now want to invite people from the audience to ask questions, put questions to the panellists.
Katie Schmucker from the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. I have a specific question for Emran, which was about the idea of sort of a place-based approach to education is not entirely new, so I was just wondering what lessons the department's learning from previous policy attempts at place-based approaches to education improvement. But I think Naomi made a really important point about linking up, and the Department for Education isn't the only department thinking about a place-based approach. The industrial strategy also talks very much about a place-based approach, and so I'm just wondering how those two things are connecting with one another. And if I were to highlight one thing, I think in terms of a policy area of my own, it's something that's sort of come up a few times today around retraining for adults who are already in the workplace. It's obviously really important to think about the future workforce and people who are going through education now, but something like 90% of our workforce in 2025 have already left education. So the sort of investment and also making sure that retraining is available to people who have low incomes, who are trapped in low pay and are able to then use that to get on, because those are the people who are much less likely to get training from their employers.
John Goldthorpe, Nuffield College.
John, thank you.
My question is also specifically to Mr. Mian. In the interventions that you're planning in social mobility cold spot areas, so-called, I'd like to ask what assumptions are these interventions based on? Because there are two quite different assumptions that could be made. One is that these areas are some way distinctive in the social mobility processes that go on within them. The other assumption is that they're not at all distinctive in this way, they're only distinctive in their social structure. In other words, that if you were to look at take the parents in these areas and you look at their incomes, you look at their social class, you look at their social status, you look at their education, then the mobility patterns are exactly what you would expect if the same processes were operating in these cold spot areas as operate in the rest of the country. The Social Mobility Commission has spent a lot of time identifying these cold spots, but they say nothing about why they believe mobility is low. Is there something distinctive in mobility processes in these areas? Or is it simply a result of what statisticians would call compositional effects? Seems to me you have to take a stance on these two possible assumptions before you can devise effective policies, and I wondered which way you were going.
Hi everyone, Jean Carwood-Edwards, Chief Executive of Early Years Scotland, and I would like to start just by saying thank you very much indeed to the Sutton Trust and all the contributors today, because I did think very carefully about coming down to London and just because of a shortage of time, but it's been very, very much worthwhile. My comment and question is around, this morning we started off with the Secretary of State saying that social mobility doesn't stop at the school gates. But until we truly do understand, recognise and take cognizance of how much social mobility needs to start well before the school gates, our progress is going to be seriously limited. Why does there continue to be such little recognition of the importance of early years as a critical foundation for social mobility? Despite the plethora of knowledge and evidence we have about how much what happens in the early years matters, the debate, investment, policy and discussion continues to be predominantly about pupils, with an inference that children are born at 5. I would appreciate it very much if any of the panel would like to comment on this.
Emran, if it's okay to start with you, I'm conscious that 2 of the questions were specifically put to you, so I hope you've had enough time to think of some sort of response.
Happy to take those. I'm starting with Katie's question in terms of lessons we can learn from previous place-based approaches. I think one I've been very conscious of as we begin to kind of get the next level of detail in opportunity areas and develop the full delivery plans is it seems to us that sometimes on previous place-based approaches there's been a decision made for admirable reasons to kind of love bomb areas with loads and loads of small initiatives, which A, makes it very difficult to evaluate what it was that actually made a difference, and B, simply creates lots of coordination challenges actually for the early years settings, the schools, everybody else in the local area. So we're very, very keen to learn from some of the issues that have been created by initiativitis in places before, and to this time through opportunity areas focus on some small things, focus on a small range of things that we think will make a difference. Also wanted to touch on your question about lifelong learning. As you no doubt know, the Conservative Manifesto included a commitment on a national retraining scheme. I think we read that as civil servants as a very significant potential development in terms of adult education and retraining. We have some money as a department to do pilots on lifelong learning over the next couple of years. We will do those and then hopefully learn from them in terms of what next to do. I think, as you know better than most, there is a long history of stuff in this space that has kind of had mixed success. And so I think we want to be very careful before we design a national scheme of actually having a really clear idea as to what's likely to work this time. On the question about what view are we taking as to the social mobility processes going on in cold spots, I'm not sure you're right that we do need to take a view, in the sense that I think we're taking a different view, which is most of these areas seem on the face of it not to have as many high-quality educational institutions spanning the full spectrum from early years through to school and so on, which would interact with the processes that you were describing and ensure that the most social mobility that you would expect to see could happen. So, you know, you would probably phrase that differently, or you might reject the premise completely, but it seems to us that to take the early years point, in a lot of the areas what we're observing is that there isn't enough high quality early years education, and that's where we need to intervene. In some of the areas we're seeing very weak outcomes at Key Stage 2 and Key Stage 4, so that's the thing that we need to intervene. And improving the quality of teaching and learning will be an important way to help to do that.
Becky, did you want to pick up on any of these points?
Yes, thank you. So on the place-based approaches point, actually I'd want to build on, I think, both of the things that have been said there. I think this need to address what's a genuine lack of capacity in some areas is really urgent, actually. So applaud the approach and would want to support that. But nevertheless, I wouldn't like to lose sight of the issue about social mobility across the board. I'm a governor at a local, very leafy middle-class school, but we still have a glaring gap for social disadvantaged pupil premium kids. That's true right across the country, and we don't want to lose sight of those kids either. So it's holding both in balance at the same time, I suppose. I think I'm proud to say that I've been the first person to mention early years, and I'm really surprised about that, actually. Because, of course, we've got a wealth of evidence about the import of that time of life for social mobility, and, of course, of the effectiveness of interventions at that age. But I do wonder that sometimes there's a sort of policy exhaustion. Something becomes almost a bit less fashionable because it's such a sort of obvious thing that's been, talked about a lot. And also the difficulties, which are genuine, of course, about implementation of genuine change there. I mean, we had, I think, a really strong piece of work in the Nut-Brown Review under the coalition government, which, Liz Truss took a sort of very measured approach to that, and I think we could have been more ambitious. So obviously some reticence there, and for me that's where we still need urgently a big push if we're to be serious about social mobility.
Thanks. Naomi, I imagine you might want to add something on the early years point.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, the depressing thing about early years, I think, is really what you just said. We know what works, and we fail to do it because it costs too much money, and because we have a tension between the flexibility that's for working parents and part-time working and the kind of regularity and systematic approach, which, can you imagine talking about 8-year-olds and saying, well, the mother only works 3 days a week, so only go to school 3 days a week. And if she works 3 days a week every other week, that some weeks they go 5 days, some week, we accept this for early years in a way that we would never accept it for statutory age children children. And if we want to get the best quality out of early years, we need a regular approach that actually addresses this tension between workplace participation and quality. We also need to pay all early years workers a lot more. And just all credit to Liz Truss. She said to enter training in early years, you needed C grade in English and maths. And the whole early years world was up in arms and said this was too high a barrier. Now, if this is too high a barrier, what are we doing to our children?
Michael.
Just to add on the debate on the opportunity areas, I've worked both in Scarborough being one of them, we ran a school there, and we run an academy in Doncaster. And in terms of social mobility, those schools were in and out of special measures for 10 years. The Doncaster school now is outstanding. We've had our first student ever to go and read medicine. So it can make a difference, but it'll be slow, but it's well worth. It's a very good policy in our view.
Hello, Emily Tanner from NatSen Social Research. I would appreciate hearing the panel's views on parenting, particularly in the early years, but also through primary school. So we know we've heard about the education gap that's there by the time children start school, and we've just heard some responses around early education, but not so much about what the role of the government should be around parenting specifically. And you may have seen new research has been published today from the study of early education and development. And I think what's really interesting there is it shows the independent effect of parenting and home environment over and above early education on children's early outcomes.
Hi, Daniel Agar, Linklaters Law Firm. My question is mainly to Mike, but I think I can open it up to kind of all the panel. Mike, you alluded to the fact that some students that don't meet entry requirements kind of get the door closed or aren't able to kind of progress into employment or further education. Recently, I think as of last year, I think companies like EY and PwC scrapped their A-level and university requirements and kind of introduced more like assessment centres and more other assessments for their students to kind of come into the workplace. Do you think that that's something other professional services should replicate, or do you think that it's not a good idea?
No, I think it's great. And I think, in fact, somebody pointed you out to me today because I want to talk to you because I've got two students, one who's got cerebral palsy, is in a wheelchair and wants to be a lawyer, and I mentioned that, and another one who doesn't want to go away from home, wants to go into law, and we're just investigating the possibility of going through the level 6 apprenticeship route with a law firm. And really I could do with a private conversation, because anything we can do to get children to move forward, then it's got to be a good thing. I remember a long time ago I was sitting in a meeting, and it was Nick Tate, I think, who headed up the Curriculum and Assessment Authority, if I think, this could be a long time ago. And he actually said in the meeting, I don't know why students at A-level do vocational courses and then go on to academic degrees. And I said, I do, because it's their route onto a degree. They were finding A-levels difficult, they went through the vocational and they still got the degree. So anything that can ease the passage into higher education for students is a good thing, because the other thing I've found out in education, that some children don't turn on till 14, 15. And that's why I never set an admission criteria for my sixth form. I said to the governors, you've got to understand, your ALP scores might not be absolutely brilliant at the beginning, but if it means some students who become very mature at the end of year 11, realise they need to work in year 12 and 13, don't set a criteria for entry. The only criteria we set was the willingness to learn. And the thing that you've just talked about is exactly what we could have done with for a long time.
Right, thanks. And I know there were a couple of other hands up, so I'll take those questions before returning to the panel more generally.
Yeah, I'm Jo Blandon from the University of Surrey, and I've been doing quite a lot of work on the early years recently. And I think that, although I think we can all agree that there's a potential for the early years to make a difference, it's been very disappointing, the evidence that we found on whether it actually does make a difference. And I think Naomi was kind of alluding to that a little bit, but I wanted to give it a bit more evidence. So, looking at the recent expansion over the 2000s in the free entitlement, we can't really see that that's made hardly any difference at all to children's outcomes. And certainly when it has, they've not been long-standing. So it really does raise some important questions about what we need to do. And I think Naomi was alluding to this about, putting more money in or finding out what matters, doing more randomised controlled trials in this area, and just taking it very seriously. And I think Becky mentioned this, that maybe people don't want to
hear any more kind of platitudes about how early years works and we need to put more money in it. But there is more recent research that asks some quite hard questions, I think, of the way this is delivered in this country.
Becky, would you like to begin?
Yes, I'd love to do the job on parenting, I think. Without wanting to be sort of dismissive, of course, social inequality and really challenging home environments does impact parenting inevitably. But I think that we need also to recognise, I mean, there was research alluded to this morning actually, but I also did some research when I was at the RSA with working class families who of course we don't talk to enough, we don't hear from enough, either working class kids or working class parents in relation to these debates. Absolutely universally, the parents that we talked to had really high aspirations for their kids, and likewise the kids themselves recognised that their parents had high aspirations for them, but they don't understand how things work in terms of sort of education credentialism and the systems, and they know they don't know how to make it work. So it was really disturbing, the anxiety felt by parents about this and the frustration of kids, like why would we listen to our parents because they don't know anything about this. I feel anxious every time we hear the word aspirations, each time we hear the word resilience. For goodness sake, you know, kids that sort of spend their life through school stuck in a bottom set but still go to school, you know, that shows to me resilience. They don't have the right cultural currency in relation to what's required for a socially mobile, particularly professional route. But we need to be honest and say we're looking for particular social skills that represent middle class modes of being. Really what we're looking at is not teamwork and so on, which working class kids have just as much as middle class kids. It's about looking people in the eye in a job interview and not having too strong an accent and so on and so forth. And I really think we need to bring a level of honesty to that debate. I know I've gone slightly off-piste from parenting, but I think it is related.
Emran.
I think not much to add on parenting. I think just to underline the challenge that there is for, I think, government getting involved in terms of helping to think about parenting. I think there's some genuine questions there about sort of proper role of the state and so on. And I think there's some real questions about, the parents that you would want to reach through initiatives. Would those be the parents who would respond well to initiatives like that if they're coming from government? So it might be that in some cases actually other partners, it might be schools themselves, are in a better place to kind of make contact with a parent and to help a parent, address literacy and numeracy issues that parent might be facing, and to recognise that there will be a shame associated for that parent with some of those literacy and numeracy challenges, and so this has to be done in a very, very sensitive way. And I think sometimes when government intervenes, it doesn't necessarily intervene in a way that's sensitive to that context.
Naomi.
Yeah, just to plug, I see Laura at the back. I've been engaged with Sutton, with funding from Sutton Trust, for something called the Parental Engagement Fund, where we were looking for interventions that actually have an impact on child's cognitive outcomes. And it's been a tremendous struggle. We have one that we've got very good results from, and now the Education Endowment Fund is doing some evaluation on it. It's been very, very difficult to find parenting interventions that reach the kind of standard where EEF will even look at them. And I would say that, two things I would say. One is that we know what works in early years, and I just don't think we do it well enough. And I think that Joe's results, I don't disagree with Joe's results, because I think the emphasis in the last 20 years has been about childcare for employment, not about early education. And if you look at the best early education, it really does do results, and it's with proper QTS trained teachers. It's not with early years teachers who we just rename them and they are not good enough. So I think that we do that. On the parenting thing, I would say that, I don't disagree with Emran about, well, what's the role of government in all this? Basically, the government has a big job to do on making early education good enough. And changing parental behavior is really, really difficult. And we've redefined poverty in terms of parental behavior, which is disgraceful. We've taken away the Social Mobility and Poverty Commission and called it the Social Mobility Commission. And then we go to DWP and define poverty based on unemployment or family breakdown or drug addiction, not on family income, which I think is absolutely disgraceful. So what I would say is, if you want to put on a parenting program, if you put it in a free laundrette, I'm there.
Michael, did you want to add, or you?
I've just had that in secondary education. It always strikes me as being a bit peculiar that a school goes into special measures and yet the parents don't take their children out, and the role doesn't fall. And yet you think if you were discerning, you'd think, I'm going to choose another school for my child, and they don't. And in the vast majority of cases, parents are very supportive of their children. They might not know how to support them, but they are extremely supportive. But I come across lots of parents who the children succeed despite their parental attitude.
I might just add a couple of quick points myself here, based on work that the all-party group did in the previous Parliament. We did an inquiry into parenting and social mobility. And actually, I think that we concluded that there was very clearly a role for government. It's not in terms of direct provision, but it is in ensuring that that sort of parenting support, very often sort of provided by the voluntary sector and others, was available, and particularly was available in those areas where parents needed it most. Also, at the risk of being slightly controversial, I would say to Becky, I do entirely understand what you're saying about resilience and aspirations and not trying to blame people. My personal view is, however, is that those remain really, and it's something I said at the beginning, incredibly important sort of issues to try to understand the impact they can have. And the APPG did about an 18-month, 2-year study about character and resilience and its direct impact on social mobility. And it was in no way trying to blame children if they didn't sort of turn up at school with the sort of attributes you might expect from a child from a more middle class background, but it did show an awful lot of things about what could be done to develop some of those sort of self-confidence, self-esteem sort of traits, and actually the impact that had on children's social mobility. So I do think there's an interesting debate to be had in that area.
This is a written question.
Okay.
Can universities raise attainment in schools other than via teacher training and educational research? What is the evidence? What do you think the Sutton Trust should focus on for the next 20 years? Where can they make the most impact?
Okay, right. So one was about what the Sutton Trust should be doing, and the other one was about, I think, the role that universities might play in teacher training.
I've got two more in
yes,
here as
thank
well.
you.
So what impact will current student loan interest rate policy have on future aspirations to attend universities? And then another one around the idea of place. Somebody who's working in the northeast of England believes that talented young people in their region face an additional barrier and distance from the centre. How do you as the panel believe that they can actively seek to address this additional barrier to social mobility?
Right, well, I'm going to ask the panel members to sort of primarily address one of those 4 questions. I'm going to sort of hope that somehow or other we are going to cover them, but we'll sort of have to see how it goes as we go down the panel. Becky?
Well, probably I should answer, or try to answer, the one about universities raising attainment in schools. It's really interesting, and some of you know, of course, that every year I'm part of the team that does the chain effects work for the Sutton Trust, looking at the role of academy chains in realising attainment for disadvantaged kids. So I'm quite au fait with the roles of universities in academy sponsorship and so forth. And within that, I'm fairly knowledgeable that it certainly hasn't been a panacea. And in relation to sort of responding to the Green Paper on this, that was my main point, that actually, with some exceptions, and I would like to count our wonderful UCL Academy within this, that's the UCL's own sponsored academy, in fact, there's very, very mixed evidence in terms of universities supporting individual academies or chains. Running a university, supporting a university is, of course, very, very different to supporting a school, and particularly a struggling school. But nevertheless, I do think that, as well as, of course, the crucial role that we continue to play in initial teacher training, and again, I'm very proud of the IOE's role. We train 2,000 teachers a year, and I think we're the biggest Russell Group provider there. Also, just the sort of creativity, definitely the programmes to support widening participation, which I think have got much more innovative and meaningful in collaboration, of course, with organisations like the Sutton Trust. And also, a real role in governance, I think, in state school governance. There is a lot of cultural capital, both residing in universities, in subject expertise and so on, of course, and being at the cutting edge of subjects, but also in supporting kids and access to universities. So I do think that there's a bigger role we could play in that regard.
Thank you very much. Emran.
Like Becky, I feel a responsibility to take one of the four questions. And in my case, it's the one on student loans. I was the lead civil servant on the Brown Review that led to the trebling of tuition fees, so I feel like I have to take that one. Do student loan interest rates have an impact on participation? I think the evidence so far suggests they do not. Participation has continued to rise. The other thing that's worth noting in this respect is that the policy decision to seek a greater contribution from graduates towards the cost of higher education was a policy decision that was needed to allow the system to grow again. It's that policy decision that allowed student number controls to be lifted, both for any individual institution and for the system as a whole. So in terms of thinking about kind of growing the numbers of young people who can go into higher education, which at the margin is going to be more likely to help the disadvantaged student, because if you ration places, it's more likely to be the case that advantaged students win those places compared to disadvantaged students. And lifting those number caps would not have been possible, in our judgment, if we hadn't also made a change to kind of for graduates to pay back more of the cost of higher education. So I don't think it has put off participation. I think the evidence so far shows that. And in fact, it's created a policy environment in which we can lift student number controls and create more places in university.
Right, well, I shall refrain from making any response there about the political fallout or impact from there. But Michael.
Universities, school's a complex place, and I always get the impression that people, because they've been to school, they know about school. And universities clearly are very good at what they do. But it's a bit like saying, Michael, go be the chief executive of the National Health Trust. I just don't know enough. I haven't got the native wit. And there's so much received wisdom in education, we have to start unpicking it. Sometimes I believe that received wisdom in education is about, if we just haven't thought about it differently. So I'll give an example. When I hear about governance in multi-academy trusts, and they say you all need a really good finance director, it isn't the finance director that makes the difference. Now, we've got a surplus of £23 million. Our schools are highly performing. We spend 15 million on rebuilding our stock. We keep 8 million because it's 2 months' salaries for contingency. The difference in a school, it's not the finance director, it's the curriculum. Because if you get the curriculum right and you timetable it properly, then you will create those surplus to reinvest in all that private tuition that we just talked about. So universities have a part to play, but they're not the panacea to improve schools.
Right. Can I take two?
Right,
on the place, I think.
On
the place, I think I've already answered that. I think that's about HS3. It is about starting to seriously invest in the north. So it isn't about reducing the barriers so it's easier to get south. It's much more about how do we invest and rebalance the economy in terms of the north of England. And I think that's absolutely critical. And education is part of that picture, but there's a much bigger picture. I'd like to just say on the role of Sutton Trust, because I forgot to say it in my notes on my introductory remarks, I am thrilled that you're beginning to look at apprenticeships, because I think we really have to reduce the notion for all, especially middle-class families, that a kid not going to university is an absolute disaster. And the more we have diversity in what happens post-school, the less it's a disaster. And I think high-level apprenticeships and medium-level apprenticeships is going to help that. I'm really, really thrilled that Sutton Trust is doing that. I think it's absolutely the right thing to do. And I think that it will help in trying to even out the social mobility problem. And I just want to say one thing about, poverty. Social mobility is important, but for me, poverty is the most important. And they're different.
Right, well, thank you very much indeed. I've just been asked to try to draw a few strands together. There's been a lot of stuff and it's been incredibly interesting, and some of it's very, very sort of big picture strategic stuff, and some of it's quite sort of specific. I'd just like to pick up, first of all, on the point that Naomi made about what the role for the Sutton Trust, actually, because I suppose my if I was responding to that, I too would like to say so much of what we talked about today is about the need to sort of to see the big picture. That's everything from sort of early years, obviously through primary and secondary school, FE, HE, apprenticeships, employers, right the way through actually to lifelong learning and adult education. And I think that having that sort of really big picture overview of social mobility is something where the Sutton Trust could really add a lot of value at the moment. Looking at that slightly sort of broader picture is something I would suggest might be very helpful there. I think we've heard a lot of really important things, as I say, through the life stages, from early years, from parenting, from all the things that Michael was talking about in schools, really about the quality of teaching, what actually happens. I was very, very taken with what you said about the sort of trying to replicate what a middle-class child might have through one-to-one tuition provided by the parents, but the school's actually doing that. I think this focus on a sort of a place-based approach, which you talked about, Emma, is really, really important. I'm frankly delighted to hear that the government is going to start to put a stronger sort of focus on place-based mechanisms. Becky, I think some of the things you were talking about particularly how you incentivise teaching, and for teachers, really good teachers, the sort of the best teachers, to actually want to go and work in some of the most disadvantaged areas, is one of the big questions that has not really been sufficiently, in my view, addressed in recent years. I mean, I've always thought that although there are many aspects to it, part of it's got to be about the reward structure. And I think that for too long, actually, we've shied away about looking at the sort of reward structure. I think there are a lot of really important points, actually, about the role both of FE colleges and of universities that they can play in this whole arena. So an awful lot, I think, for us to think about going forward. So I would like to finish by thanking the panel very much indeed. Can we give them a round of applause?